Okay, and I was going over our DRA classroom profile, and I was noticing that the majority of our students, probably over 75% of them, were still missing that summarizing element.
The retelling.
Yeah, and especially when it comes down to story structure, being able to identify the characters and the
Yeah.
setting.
Most of them weren't very detailed and using the actual name and going in more depth with it.
So I was wondering, why? Why are they having such a hard time with this? I feel like maybe they're not even asking questions as they're reading.
True.
So I thought maybe we could focus on that in the next couple of lessons.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think that's a good idea to
Yeah.
focus on that? Okay. I thought then we would try to look at the standards and
Okay.
figure out which standards we want to focus on.
Do you want to look at them?
Yeah, let's look at them. You have them on there too
Yeah.
as well. And we'll be looking at the literature standards because we'll be using a fiction piece to start with.
Okay. I think RL.2.5,
Okay.
describe the overall structure of a story, including describing how the beginning includes the story and the ending includes the action.
Okay. Yeah,
And possibly even the very first one.
Okay, and that one addresses...
It's ask and answer such questions as who, what, where, when, why, and how to demonstrate understanding of key details in the text. I think that's what, like you said, they're not asking themselves questions, so they can't verbally do it as they're comprehending the text.
So those standards kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
For us. Okay, well that makes it much easier.
Do you want to unpack them?
Yeah, let's go through and I have
The
this
verbs.
Unpacking Standards graphic organizer.
Okay.
So I thought we can go through that together and just bounce ideas off each other and figure out what sub-skills are needed in order for our students to perform.
All right.
So let's start first. We know that this is second grade, and the subject is going to be reading literature. And the standards we decided on is the RL 2.1. And it's all about asking the questions, right?
Key ideas and details.
To understand key details. Before we go forward, I always like to put it in kid-friendly language because I like the kids to kind of know what we're working towards.
You want to do an I can statement?
Yeah, let's see. Maybe we can do that underneath that standard so let them know what we're working on.
I can ask and answer questions about a text in order to understand it better. Should we be more specific of which questions?
I'm wondering if we do. I really feel like the more specific we can get,
Okay.
Then they know exactly what we're asking them to do. So maybe if we even say, I can ask maybe those
Just-
WH questions,
Yeah,
like
so
what,
who, what, where, when, why, and then how.
To understand a piece of literature.
Okay.
Actually, let's even go deeper. Let's to understand story elements
Okay.
or the structure of a piece of literature.
Yeah,
Story
and then that'll
structure.
connect it to the next standard, since it's more about craft and structure.
And then underneath it, I'll also include that our I can statement kind of encompasses both of those
Yeah.
standards. So I'm going to go ahead and write that standard as well, and then it's RL 2.5.
5.
So I thought this next part would be a great thing for you to take a look at closer. We're going to look
Okay.
at the standards and just identify the verbs we see. And I think this will really help us identify the depth of knowledge we're
Yeah.
asking for. So I'm going to let you look at that standard more closely and then
Okay.
just kind of shout out the verbs that you see, and we'll write those down.
All right, let's do the first one. So ask,
Okay.
answer, demonstrate, and then understanding, I guess. Demonstrate understanding. And then the next one, describe. Well, it kind of goes, it's not necessarily what they're doing, but introduces and concludes. But that's,
Yeah, I like the idea of describe. To me, describing tells me what I'm asking the student to do specifically.
Yeah.
So we have ask, answer, demonstrate, and
Demonstrate
describe.
understanding.
Yeah, this one, leave that all together. Demonstrate understanding. Because I think that's going to be important because we're going to have to identify how we expect them to demonstrate
they're
that
going to
understanding.
reach that standard, okay.
And then basically the next part is concepts, the nouns part.
Yeah.
What we want the student to know when we're done with these lessons.
Okay.
So let's just kind of brainstorm around that. What are we expecting them to know specifically when we're done with these lessons that the standard addresses?
So do you want to go through all the
Yeah,
nouns?
let's go
Okay,
through the
let's
nouns real
do questions.
Okay.
And then all of the W's
Questions,
and
okay.
H.
Okay.
Key details. In text.
Next.
Overall structure.
And I'd like to dig a little deeper, I think, when we talk about overall structure.
More
When
just-
you think about overall structure, what are some of those elements that you think of? And so we can make sure that we're on the same page.
Okay.
And we're going to, before we take it together.
Okay. So like characters,
Okay.
mainly
agree
all
with
the
that.
story elements.
Mhm.
Events,
Setting.
setting, problem, and solution.
That's exactly what I was thinking. So that means
Okay.
we're on the same page, and so when
And
we go
those
to
are the main-
the lesson design,
Okay.
that's make sure we hit that, okay? We have to pick a critical area of focus.
So mainly that's kind of, all right, I can statement and really hitting those specific story elements that we want them to comprehend and verbally retell it.
Right, and I think that the path to get there is that first standard. By asking questions, then I can perform this critical area of focus. This
Okay.
second standard. I agree. So the story structure. And the next part of this is the learning goal, which we already did up here.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to kind of draw an arrow because
Okay.
the learning goal for me is always
The
the
kid-friendly.
kid-friendly language. I just feel like we're all going to be on the same page if we all use the same
Yeah.
language.
And we always usually open and close with that too.
Yes, perfect. And that essential, the next part of it is the essential questions. What questions can we ask to spur or to engage the students in the type of thinking that we want them to perform?
Okay.
So I have to think about asking myself. Maybe even start with that standard of the WH question.
True.
And what questions would you ask yourself?
So, who is the story about?
We want to make sure that as we design the lesson, that we are embedding these questions. And then think of some interesting ways to maybe cooperative learning
Yeah,
structures
that's what I
that
was
we
just
can
thinking.
use to ask those and engage the students. Okay, here's the story out, and when did the story take place?
And where? What happened? What?
What is the problem?
Yeah,
in
what is the
story?
problem?
We've kind of talked about the story arc. That every story has to have some problem.
Mhm.
Otherwise, there's really not much to engage the reader. And solution, because I feel like most kind of goes hand in hand. I don't have to know how it- I always like to throw in that how.
How did they solve?
Yeah. Contemplative decision. How did the character solve it? The next thing is, how are we going to know to know?
What
How
are
are we going
they-
to tell
yeah.
that the lesson was successful and they really did attain that standard?
Well, I guess we have to think about the ultimate goal.
Which is for them to be able to
Retell. And then, especially since we want them to end at a level 28, that makes them write more. So write the retelling. We could even do a cooperative learning structure so it's not just one person. They can work with a group.
So in order to increase engagement and make sure everyone
Yeah.
is able to do it, doing some type of thing.
But then with that, since they are working together, while they're in those cooperative learning groups, walking around and taking those anecdotal notes to see who truly is understanding, and even while we're doing whole group.
And so when we're taking those anecdotal notes, are we going to be looking for something specific? Or are we just going to be looking for overall engagement? Or are we going to be looking for something directly related to the standard?
I think maybe these questions, who is answering those questions when they're talking to each other, who has those,
So who is asking
because that's the other thing, they have to ask.
and answering? Yeah, because I see that here under the verbs, ask is a
Mhm.
big part of that. So asking and answering. I want to think about now, the next verb is demonstrate and understanding. At
Mhm.
what depth are we asking them to understand the story? Is it just going to be like identifying these elements, or are they going to have to dig deeper, maybe do some inferring?
I think a lot of it is going to be that how question as well. Why did this happen? So since it is a whole group lesson, I think they should be able to comprehend a little bit more. Since we are reading it together, it should be a little bit deeper of those how and why questions.
Totally agree. So I really feel like this part of it is going to kind of tell us what they had to know
Mhm.
prior to this lesson. Do you feel our students really understand the important parts of retelling? Do they understand that retelling should be specific, or do you feel like they just kind of gloss over the top of it?
I feel they know,
Mm-hmm.
but they just can't do it themselves. Because I feel when we do a whole group things, they can answer those questions. They can identify. It's just then taking it independently. But I don't think we've dug deeper on the how and why yet. I think they could
So maybe,
identify them.
so I'm thinking that this is a great way to kind of gradually release the responsibility.
Yeah.
We start a whole group, ask them to do it together, then maybe we break them down into smaller groups, and then eventually
Mhm.
we ask them to do it independently when we're getting to that assessment piece.
Yeah, 'cause
Okay,
that's,
great.
yeah.
All right, perfect. So the next step is then how do we take all of this and put it into a lesson that is engaging, that is maybe including some cooperative learning strategies, and then decide what co-teaching strategy we can use to really, make the lesson a home
Yeah.
run. Really do help our kids learn as best they can.
Okay.
Let's do that. Okay, so after looking over the graphic organizer, I thought what we would do is use this Madeline Hunter lesson plan template.
Okay.
I really feel like this method encompasses all the great things that we need for
Yeah,
our kids to learn.
and it comes very naturally. And you're, yeah.
That's
Okay.
great. So as we kind of go through, let's be thinking about what's the best way to get this particular skill
Mhm.
across to our students, and then the best way for them to be able to reverse that
Yeah.
so that we can assess.
Okay.
Okay. So again, I'm just going to fill this out as we go.
Okay.
The subject area is again literacy. The grade level is second grade. I'm going to skip unit title. Actually, no, maybe I'll just put retelling at the top so that you know that this is kind of an all over encompassing title of
Okay.
the skill we're asking them to do.
Let's think about time.
Yeah.
Okay, so we go from 9:30. I don't want it too long.
Right. I mean, my rule of thumb is if they're second graders, they're new to
Yeah.
the loop. Okay? I try not to go over, take their age plus maximum,
Yeah.
5 to 6 minutes without some kind of break.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to ask them to sit on the carpet and listen, I never try to go over, 12 minutes.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time for a second grader.
I think this will be a good, maybe week-long kind of
And-
little unit.
As long as if we give them a break to go and perform something and then
True.
come back to the carpet, I feel like that's okay too.
Mhm.
A chance for them to talk about something and then come back and listen. I just always view that as that's a maximum a second grader can listen.
Yeah.
I mean, they're checked out by that point. So 9:30, let's say maximum.
Okay.
9:45, I
9:45.
think. Maximum we're going to ask
Carpet,
them
yeah.
to sit. Okay. Now that could go longer if we're going to give them some kind of performance
And we
task.
have, that's okay.
Our
So we have
cooperative
enough
learning.
time.
Yeah, we have plenty of time for this, so I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, we have the objectives, which I think we'll use our
I can-
kid-friendly language, our can statement. And can you just read that to me out loud one more time?
I can ask who, what, when, why, and how to understand the story structure of a piece of literature.
Now let's think about materials or resources we might need in order to teach this standard.
Okay, so let's think about reading a book that would be good to ask those deep questions. So maybe a book that involves a lot of inferring.
And I just was at a conference and somebody brought up the title of a book that has a lot of inferring and really cool graphics that kind of entice the reader.
So I want them engaged.
And so I brought it along with me just in case. So I'll have you look at it. Just the title of this book is Two Bad Ants by Chris Van Allsburg.
Okay.
I feel like it really
Looks like-
pushes students to ask questions.
Looks like it has a lot of higher vocab too.
Right. So exposing them, which I think is great because if we're going to teach this whole group, we're not asking them to do it independently. It's a great place to kind of push the envelope when it comes to reading level and vocabulary.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and put that down for now. We can always change our mind later if we decide that it doesn't necessarily meet our needs, but I really feel like this is a good
Yeah.
text. Now, we got to think about what is the best way for students, for us to teach this to students. I keep going back to, we could just read this book, but how?
Maybe more model, think aloud of how a true reader goes about. So looking first at the cover, asking your questions right away, even when you're looking at the cover. Maybe even taking a picture walk with predictions.
You know what? I
Maybe.
used a tool last year that really, just what you just said, really helps you kind of get through all of those things. And I think it's called the Go chart.
Okay.
It's kind of based on what they call a Go map, but it's actually a great tool for a whole group lesson that leads you through all of those questions, gives you a chance to predict. So maybe we could try that again.
Sure.
Okay. I'll show you more specifically. And I'm thinking since it's whole group, we can use the Go chart either on a big piece of paper on the front of the room,
Okay.
or we could even do something with technology like
On the
smartboard.
smartboard.
What is your preference? What do you think would
Let's
be
do
more
more
engaging?
technology.
Okay.
They like to use the smartboard. And we could even put the book on the smartboard.
yeah.
Remember when we did that? They really were engaged when the pictures. We used Story Creator.
Right. So
That
we
way,
could use
all
it
the
to-
kids, since it is a smaller book, they liked that. And we could even, yeah,
Because last time you even recorded our voices.
true.
reading
They
aloud.
really kind of thought that was cool.
Kind of felt like a movie to them.
So that way they're engaged more and comprehending more.
Put that in my notes.
And we could just do the whole thing that way because we were able to start and stop anytime we wanted to.
Okay, now let's discuss this Go chart.
Okay.
Whenever I picture it in my head, I just kind of draw myself a T-chart,
Okay.
except for we're going to need several sections because we're going to be asking them to kind of go through the story in a linear fashion. Starting with, of course, one of the first things I always do as a reader is when I'm looking at the cover, I'm making predictions.
Okay.
What is the story about? What do I think the story is? What does the title mean? And so I think we're going to start with prediction based on cover. So let's think of a question that would lead them into that type of thinking.
Okay. So, just what do you think the story is going to be about?
So it's a what question now, and that's what we're going to ask them to do.
Mhm.
Is ask this what. Okay. Now, because this book has so much rich vocabulary, and vocabulary maybe they're not aware of, and I want to push that because a lot of our kids struggle with vocabulary, I'd like them to make predictions about what kind of vocabulary they'll think they'll see in this book.
Okay.
For example, I just keep thinking well, I might, if I'm talking about ants, maybe the word antennae.
True. And they probably don't know that proper.
They may have no clue what that is.
Okay.
Or they may know, and that's great that they're able to make those kind of predictions as a reader. Or
think-
maybe anthill. Kind of gets, to me, I think it's accessing that background knowledge.
That's what I was just
What
thinking.
do I know about ants?
Yeah. And I think that connects then with what's going to happen in the story too.
We're going to ask them make predictions on what type of vocabulary we think they might see.
That's
And-
probably going to engage them while we read, and when those pop up, they'll be excited to see those words
Right, we can
that
add
they
them to the
already
list.
predicted about.
Yeah, and words they haven't seen yet,
Yeah.
we can add to the list. It gives us a
Mhm.
chance to define them for them so they can use them in the future.
Okay.
Okay?
So that's just those two are just based on the cover.
Just on the cover.
Okay.
And then what we're going to, that's that time where, remember you brought up picture walk.
Okay. During these two, should we do a cooperative learning? That way it gets their minds going, maybe turn and talk with a partner.
Yeah.
Like, take a minute to yourself, look at the cover, think, and then turn and talk. That way, just a chance for them to talk.
And it makes me think, maybe I'll have some kids who may not even know what that looks like.
Okay.
So this may be a chance for us to co-teach. maybe we model for
how
them
to turn and talk.
how to turn and talk,
Okay.
and how to ask important questions about it.
Okay.
So, when maybe we start off with, Ms. Chavez, I noticed that there are two ants on the cover of this book, and I noticed the title says Two Bad Ants. I think if I was going to make a prediction, it might sound something like, I think that these ants are going to get into a lot of trouble, and maybe break some rules, and that's why their title is Two Bad Ants. But I'm not really sure what rules they'll break or where that'll take place yet, but I definitely know that Two Bad Ants means that they're definitely going to be doing something that's naughty.
Okay.
And then, maybe then
Just
give it a chance for
model.
you to, no, you tell me what
Okay.
you're doing.
That's a good idea.
So then we have that modeling piece in there.
Mhm.
Then we just do the picture walk.
Okay.
This will give them a chance, I think, to make predictions based on the story as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Just using and making them look closer at the pictures, because I really
True.
feel like the pictures are a great, a great clue as to what's going on, and you use them a lot when you're going to be using that deeper skill of inferring.
Mm-hmm.
But I just love it.
They are really cool.
Really cool pictures.
Should we show the whole book?
Good question. Because I don't want to give away the ending necessarily, because I
Yeah.
do want to encourage that inferring. What do you think? Do you think it's a good idea to go all the way through, or maybe should we stop at a certain point?
Since it is a longer book, I think maybe stop.
Okay.
Because it is going to take a while to read,
Mhm.
so maybe we'll have a stopping point in the middle.
So you're already kind of seeing this as maybe at least a 2-day kind of
Yeah.
lesson. So under co-teaching here, I'm just going to put
So right away, since we're going to be modeling, that's going to be more of the
team teaching.
team teach in that part. But we might include another,
Right.
especially in the beginning.
Perfect. So at least that part. And it's okay sometimes to switch between those strategies
Yeah.
in one lesson. I don't feel like we have to stick with one particular strategy for an entire lesson. I
Sure.
feel like we're going to do what's best for
Yeah,
kids.
and especially since this is more than one day.
Right. So for now, I'm just going to write that in the bottom so
Okay.
we know that we're going to be teaching this part, and then we may decide to change as we go.
Okay.
So then we're going to ask them to make predictions based on the picture walk. So I want to think about, let's go back to predictions of vocabulary and think of what kind of question we can use
Okay.
to spur that thinking.
So for vocab.
What words might we see in this text? And I like that question, why? Because I think that's going to push them to the next level
True.
of
So
thinking.
when they say, well, why would you think that? So they can support their answer.
Because we have to be able to assess whether we really understand it. And I think the why really gives me a clue as to, do they really understand why we're asking this question, and why might I see that word in this book, not just some random word from it. And then after they're giving them the picture walk, what question should we ask them?
I think more, probably the same as the first. What do you think is going to happen? But then maybe do that why,
Okay.
because they can back it up with a picture now. Well, which picture? Why do you say that? And we could even have them, come up and show that. Okay, well, I saw this, and so I think this is going to happen.
And so that really addresses that plot part of it. So I feel like we can even ask a who question here.
True.
Who are the characters in this book based on the pictures?
And even the setting.
Where does the story take place? The great thing about this tool is then once we've read through the text, we actually can go back and confirm.
True.
Or if we're wrong, then we go back and change. because that's what we do as great readers
Yeah.
already. We do it in our heads. We don't even make notice of it, but when you're learning to read, I think kids don't even realize
Mhm.
that's what they're supposed to do or notice it. So I really want to kind of pinpoint, you know what, it's okay to go back and change your mind. That's what we do.
Yeah. Okay. And that would be easy on the smart card too. We could even highlight the ones that we were correct on our predictions.
So we've already kind of demonstrated routine teaching and turn talk, think aloud,
Mhm.
modeling for them. So the next part of this is after reading. Okay, so or
Okay.
during reading, we're going to ask them to take note of things.
Okay.
What are some important things that you noticed about the story, or even the picture?
I feel that word they're going to need a model.
So what does notice mean? Okay. Can you think of a way to do that?
I think maybe the same that we did with the turn and talk. Just both of us, demonstrating. Or even just, it doesn't really have to be because it's one or two people. It could just be one person, Well, this is what I noticed. Now can you think for yourself, what did you notice in the story that happened?
So we want to model and noticing first.
Yeah.
And then give them a chance to maybe try and do that with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So
or even we
maybe-
could do a speed dating.
Okay, we could do that. And that's a great...
That way they're up and moving.
So then I'm thinking, what a teaching strategy. What about, could we do one teach, one observe in that way? Because one person can be kind of facilitating that
And
process,
then
and the
one
other
could
person
do
can be taking
anecdotal.
anecdotal notes.
Yeah.
Is that gonna work? And again, that's, that speed dating is a cooperative learning strategy and huge engagement that takes very little time.
Mhm.
And you get the whole class through and their ideas in less than 5 minutes.
And they already know how to do that because they've done it so many times.
So, I'm really thinking at this point, that's enough for the first day. Just that
Alright.
prediction piece.
Mhm. And we can even see how it goes in the beginning. And if we feel like we need to stop, then we can take an extra day.
Okay, next step then is I want to take this, what we just kind of sketched out, and go deeper and
Okay.
make sure that we have hit all the elements of our lesson plan.
Okay.
Okay. First thing is kind of how are we going to lead the kids into this type of thinking, anticipatory set? How can we get them excited about this
Mhm.
lesson? And so we kind of thinking about that.
Okay.
Sometimes I like to start with a question, again, to help them access the background knowledge. Or, somehow relate themselves, put themselves in that story.
Mhm.
Like maybe, think about a time that,
You did something bad.
you did something bad or naughty, and, what were the repercussions, or
Mhm.
what was the situation?
Yeah, I think they'll have fun with that too, answering questions, and then bring up the book.
Help them identify
Yeah.
with the characters,
And
and
just
set up that
yeah,
thinking.
get their prior knowledge ready.
So you're going to start with that question? You think that's
Yeah,
good?
that'll be good.
For me, I just like starting with questions to kind of start that thinking process. So,
Mhm.
have you ever been in trouble or done something wrong? Something against the rule? And again, we're asking for the objective, which we stated here in the
Mhm.
statement.
I think we could, after we ask that question, talk a little bit, bring up the I can statement because they're used to hearing that in the lessons, and then introduce the book and do those first predictions and stuff. That way it ties in. They know what we're doing, and this is what we're going to use to help us with our I can statement.
So after the opportunity to kind of talk about their own situation and say, well, we're going to use this book in order to perform, blah, blah, blah. Okay.
And also, I think we need to review those questions, just so we are sure that they know the who, what, when, and even, sometimes they can get confused with what a true question is.
And that's the next part of this lesson, is all about input. What do we want to make sure they know at the beginning of this lesson?
Yeah.
And that's going to help them perform the skill that we're
Mhm.
asking them to. And so maybe clarifying,
Mhm.
what is a who question, what is a what question, is important.
Hopefully that's quick and fast.
And I think because of the groundwork we've laid, it will be.
Yeah.
But it's always, you always have, a few that might even reminder or just clarification.
Yep.
I always like to explain to kids why that's important. I don't want to learn a skill just for knowing the skill's sake, but
Mhm.
why is it important? How is it going to help me as a reader?
So,
The great next piece is modeling, and we talked about modeling
Yeah.
all along. So that's going to just be embedded as part
Mhm.
of our natural lesson. Anytime you're dealing with new readers, I think the more we model, the better off we are.
yeah.
So that's definitely going to be. To me, this is a big checking for understanding. How do we
Yes.
know they know? And that helps us decide whether we can move on or we cannot.
Mhm.
There's no point in moving on if they don't understand the first part of the lesson. We had talked about briefly, the turn talks
Mhm.
and taking notes during that time. I think that's great. But how are we
Yeah.
going to address?
I
I
want
guess it's
them-
two ways. If the whole group's not answering it right, how do we address that? And if it's just a few kids, how do we address that?
I want them to actually do something, and so they're even more engaged.
Okay. Any ideas for
Maybe
that?
since we do use that Go map in writing
Mhm.
with the beginning, middle, and end, we can maybe use that as a tool to retell. Amazing how we do that with reading.
So would you have them write individually? Would you have them write as a group? Would you have them?
Right now, maybe as a group.
Okay. Why?
I think maybe it'd be a little too much to ask them right away by themselves retell this whole story.
Because right now, I agree with you. I don't know if we're really focused on the writing aspect of
Mhm.
things. We're just checking for the understanding.
Yeah, it's more that verbal listening to that, then explain their thinking.
So is the
We could
writing
even
part
do it.
important?
Maybe we could do it more. No, not necessarily, I guess. You're right.
So I'm wondering if we have them come back cooperative,
Together, yeah.
talk, and then maybe present to the rest of the class.
Sure. I think that would
Just
be good because
verbally.
we just want them to actually comprehend right now. We don't want pencil and paper.
So that's to be muddy the waters. I think the easiest one to be for them to understand and for us to assess.
Mhm.
So group discussion and then presenting the discussion back to the class. I always think, the more that people share their thinking, the easier it will be for some students to
Mhm.
understand the task.
I think that would be a good resource, though, still, to maybe have that up, just how we do in writing, so they remember, okay, beginning, middle, end, so they can just refer back.
Okay.
Just have a visual of that.
The next part is the guided practice. I want to give them an opportunity to perform the task, but still have us
Yeah.
there to kind of facilitate it. Because it is so new, especially for when they include the writing.
True.
We want to make sure they feel supported and it doesn't reach frustration levels,
Mhm.
because then everything shuts down. So I'm going to think about, how do I give them an opportunity to do that? And again, we can use that even as an assessment tool. Actually, I'm thinking about this right now, and I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, well, we just asked them to go back and do a group discussion and present. During that time, you and I could be facilitating that thinking,
Mhm.
correct? So that would be almost a guided practice.
True.
Because
Because we would they be-
you and I could separate ourselves into different groups.
Yeah.
I'm almost wondering if we were to break the classroom in half and do
A parallel
a
kind
parallel
of teaching.
it would give us an opportunity to make the group smaller and help facilitate some of that thinking.
And I think they'd have fun maybe working with groups and us, and it could even kind of be like a competition type of thing.
And then we'll come back and present to
Yeah.
each other on the opposite side.
Mhm.
Okay. So I'm gonna put it in here. So we're gonna do parallel teaching for this part, for the discussion piece. I just think it helps break down the class into smaller groups and make it easier for us to really support thinking.
And that way, since it won't be 4 kids, and one kid would have to remember, oh gosh, what am I going to tell the whole class? You know, they can just say one little thing, since it will be a larger group, and they do present. It'll be
Take some of
easier
that
on
pressure
them.
off, you know. Now, we have to close the lesson at the end of this day.
Mhm.
I feel like we spent a lot of time this first day focused on predicting
Yes.
and asking those questions. So let's think about what is a way that we can kind of review the method that we taught them and remind them of the objective as we leave the lesson.
Okay. More coming together.
A group again.
Yeah.
Okay.
We could even just have just more of a discussion together, and we can get those deep thinking, since we have read the book, comprehended everything, and asking those why.
With the
Or
predictions.
even, you know, relating it back to when they are independent, because we want them to do this independently, you know. So when you go and you are reading to yourself, how are you going to take what we did?
I see what you're saying. It's almost setting yourself up for the next day's lesson.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. So a discussion, whole group.
Mhm.
Again, maybe we go back to team teaching.
Yeah, that would be
You know,
easy.
where you and I can even ask questions to them about the method, you know, and why that method's important. Or maybe just have them the chance to speak talk with each other about what they took away from that lesson.
Yeah.
If we wanted to have a product, we can have them just do a little exit slip, you know,
Yeah.
something that says, you know, what did I learn today? Why is that important to me as a reader?
Mhm.
And that would give us both an opportunity to kind of circulate around the room and handle any
Yeah.
misunderstandings of the method.
Mhm.
Wait.
And we can just see what more we need to do after this too.
Then we take those slips to kind of
Yeah.
say, where are the holes?
Mhm.
And what do we need to fill in?
And we can get specific kids who really need more help.
At this point, I really don't feel like I would ask them to do anything independent practice with these methods.
Yeah.
It's just too new. But, you know, eventually we're going to have to assess whether or not we can do it
Yeah.
independently. But I think at this point in the lesson, it's not really appropriate. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
And we've already discussed several co-teaching strategies throughout this lesson. I feel like we started with whole group, then we did some parallel, or team teaching, then parallel, and then one teach, one observe.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you feel like all of those co-teaching strategies help facilitate this learning and lesson?
I think so.
And
better
again,
with
we
the
can always
kids.
adjust if we notice that, you know, maybe this particular strategy is not getting the lesson point across,
We
then
can
we
always
can
change it.
change. Okay. All right. Do you have any questions?
No, I think we're good.
I think we're good. We'll try it and see how it goes.